Hey everyone, this is Dullahan, your sleep storyteller. Before you fall asleep, be sure to like and subscribe to listen to more of my stories. Tell us where you're from in the comments, cozy up, and relax. Lake Superior's shores have always felt like home to me. There's a power in the vastness, a kind of harsh beauty that demands respect. I've spent most of my life out on those waters, first learning from my father, then striking out on my own. The lake can be calm as glass one moment and raging the next, with waves tall enough to swallow a boat whole. It's easy to forget that it's not just a lake, it's a force that keeps secrets and claims lives. People say the lake never gives up her dead, not like other bodies of water. The icy depths preserve what they've taken, keeping it in silence beneath the waves. Over the years, I've known more men than I care to count who went out on Superior and never came back. Even the locals stay wary, especially when fog rolls in, thick and blinding, making the lake feel like it stretches on forever. And then, there's the stories of the lights. You can ask any old-timer on the shore about them. Strange, glowing orbs that sometimes appear on the lake's surface, drifting like ghostly lanterns. Some say they're the spirits of sailors lost to the depths. Others claim they're warning signs, portents of storms or accidents. Growing up, I heard plenty of tales about the lights. My father always said they were nothing but campfire stories, meant to spook newcomers and keep folks from venturing too far at night. And I believed him. But every legend has a kernel of truth, doesn't it? I'm not one to buy into ghost stories, but I'll tell you, there are things I've seen on that lake that I can't explain. Things that have changed me. And I'm not talking about tricks of the eye or figments of an overworked mind. No, I mean real, bone-deep fear. The kind that sticks to you, follows you, settles in your dreams, and when you're alone in the dead of night, it whispers in your ear, reminding you of what you saw. It was early October, late in the evening, the last trip I ever took out on the lake alone. I remember the cold settling in, the nights turning longer, and the fog thicker than ever. The shoreline was all but invisible, blurred by a mist that seemed to cling to the water, stretching as far as my eyes could see. I felt a chill that night, one that went deeper than the autumn air, though I told myself it was just the season. You see, I'd always felt safe on Superior. I knew her moods, her temperament, and I'd been out in worse weather than a simple October night. But something felt different. It was quiet. Too quiet. Not a ripple, not a gust of wind, nothing but the soft lapping of water against my boat. Even the gulls were silent. That was when I saw it. The faintest glimmer of light on the water. A flickering glow hovering just above the surface. At first, I thought it was another boat, maybe a fisherman who drifted too far. But as I watched, the light didn't move the way a boat should. It wavered, almost dancing, like it was beckoning. I can still see it, clear as day, that single, pale light cutting through the fog. It was otherworldly. I wanted to turn away, to ignore it and head back, but curiosity got the better of me. My gut told me something was off, but years of being on the lake had left me stubborn. I'd grown accustomed to being in control, to understanding the lay of the water. I didn't believe in ghostly lights or trapped spirits. And so, against every instinct, I turned my boat toward that faint, glimmering glow, edging closer and closer, one slow row at a time. The lake was a blanket of shadows as I edged my boat toward the light, the fog swirling thick and cold around me. Each stroke of the oars sent ripples across the dark water, and that strange light danced just ahead, dipping and flickering as if it were leading me deeper into the fog. At first, I tried to tell myself it was just another fisherman, maybe someone lost in the mist, but the light was too wrong for that. It wasn't steady the way a lantern would be. Instead, it pulsed, almost breathing, hovering barely above the waterline. And despite the clear, still night, it looked hazy, as though surrounded by a faint mist of its own. Something about it sent a chill into my bones, colder than the autumn air could explain. Still, I kept rowing. I'd been out on the lake enough times to know that a stranded boater was nothing to ignore. Besides, I thought, maybe my mind was playing tricks on me in the low light. It wouldn't be the first time a long night out had me seeing things that weren't there, but the closer I got, the stranger it seemed. No matter how hard I rowed, the light stayed just out of reach, drifting farther whenever I neared it. I could feel the tension building in my gut, like something was warning me to turn back, but I pressed on. Pride, maybe, or stubbornness. Either way, I wasn't about to let a flickering light spook me. As I rowed, I began hearing something faint in the distance, a kind of soft rhythmic sound, like water slapping against the hull of another boat. I stopped rowing and held my breath, listening. For a moment, everything went silent again. No wind, no birds, not even the faint hum of insects from the shore. Just the lapping of water around my boat and the low, pulsing light in the distance. And then, from somewhere out there, I heard it. A faint, distant voice, almost like a whisper on the breeze. At first, I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it grew louder, tugging at the edges of my mind, like someone calling my name. I shivered, telling myself it was only the wind, but deep down, I knew better. A strange feeling crept over me then, an uneasy weight settling in my chest. I'd spent countless nights out on the water alone, weathered all sorts of storms, and I'd never felt this way. It was as if something unseen was watching me, studying me. I glanced around, half expecting to see a shadow or a face in the fog, but there was nothing. Just the thick mist and that pulsing, unnatural light. I rowed harder, determined to reach it, thinking I'd find the source of the light and finally put my mind at ease. But every stroke seemed to drive me farther into the fog, into an unfamiliar stretch of water. The shore was invisible now, swallowed by the mist, and I realized with a sickening twist in my stomach that I had no idea which direction I'd come from. The light drifted again, flickering just at the edge of my vision. That faint voice returned, clearer this time, but still too quiet to make out the words. It didn't sound angry or hostile, just desperate, a kind of pleading that stirred something in me, even though my rational mind was screaming that it was impossible. The fishermen's tales of the lights crept back into my memory, the stories I'd always dismissed as nonsense. Old sailors whispering about ghostly lights that lured boats to their doom, the souls of drowned men forever trapped beneath the Superior's depths. I'd laughed it off as superstition, a tale for tourists, a story to keep kids from wandering too far at night. But now, alone in the cold fog, the tales didn't feel so far-fetched. I gripped the oars tighter, my hands going numb in the chill. For a long moment I just sat there, watching that strange, distant light flickering in the mist. Every part of me wanted to turn back, to break away from that horrible silence, but I couldn't. It was as if the light had a hold on me, drawing me deeper, making me forget everything but the need to reach it. So, against every instinct, I dipped the oars back into the water and kept rowing, letting the light guide me, even as that voice whispered louder, echoing in the back of my mind, and in that moment I felt it. I wasn't alone out there. Something was waiting for me, just beyond the light. The light was like a beacon now, drawing me farther from anything familiar. The fog thickened around me, swallowing up the lake, until even the water directly beneath the boat looked dark and strange, like a black mirror stretching on forever. I was starting to lose my bearings, feeling like a single speck in an endless void. It was then I noticed the light had changed. There were two of them now. No, three. I watched in horrified fascination as they multiplied, each faint glow hovering like ghostly lanterns over the water. Panic pricked at my mind. I didn't know which way to row anymore. The lights seemed to be everywhere, surrounding me, and I could no longer see any trace of the shore. The stillness was absolute, pressing in on all sides. Only my breathing and the steady beat of my heart filled the silence until the faint voices started again. They were clearer now, close enough that I could almost understand them. Whispers, fragmented words, like a chorus of desperate pleas blending together. I froze, listening hard, gripping the oars so tightly my knuckles ached. I could hear them murmuring, voices layered over one another, growing louder with every passing second. A chill swept over me, settling deep in my bones. The words became clearer, fragments that I could almost piece together. I heard one whisper, "Please," another say, "Help me," and another, "Don't leave." The desperation in their voices made my skin crawl. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was the sound of the wind or the play of water against the hull. But the whispers were too human, too urgent. Then, just out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A faint outline in the mist, barely more than a shadow, drifting at the edge of one of the lights. I turned, staring hard, but it vanished as soon as I looked directly at it. My breath caught. I could have sworn I'd seen a figure, a tall, dark shape, standing perfectly still in the fog. Another shadow appeared, then another, each of them just on the edges of my vision, like they were circling the boat. Every time I turned to look, they'd vanish back into the mist. My heart was hammering now, the cold biting through my jacket as I forced myself to stay calm. But the voices only grew louder, more urgent, and the shadows began to look like people, reaching out, drifting closer. I wanted to scream, to row away as fast as I could, but I felt frozen, mesmerized by the sight of them. The shadows flickered, drifting closer and closer until they were nearly within arm's reach. I could make out the faint outlines of faces, twisted in expressions of pain and longing. Their mouths moved, forming words I couldn't understand, but their eyes, they stared right at me, unblinking, pleading. Suddenly, a voice cut through the others, louder, clearer than the rest. It was a man's voice, hoarse and strained, as though it had been screaming for far too long. "Help us." My blood ran cold. I was rooted to the spot, staring at the figure closest to me. His eyes locked onto mine, and I saw a pain there that felt endless, a horror that went far beyond what I could comprehend. The realization hit me like a punch. I wasn't just seeing shadows. I was seeing the souls of those who had been lost to the lake, their lives claimed by Superior, their spirits trapped in the waters. They weren't just trying to scare me, they were calling out, desperate, yearning for escape. One of the figures reached a hand toward me, skeletal and half-transparent, fingertips hovering inches from my arm. I tried to pull back, but I felt an invisible weight keeping me in place, drawing me closer. The cold intensified, the air heavy with the weight of their sorrow and pain, pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. "Please, help us," they whispered, the chorus swelling into a desperate wail that sent ice through my veins. The water began to churn around the boat, small waves forming, rocking me back and forth, as if the lake itself was alive, trying to pull me under. Panic surged through me. I gripped the oars, desperately trying to shake off the feeling of paralysis. But my gaze stayed locked on the ghostly figure closest to me, that pleading look in his eyes burrowing into my mind. I felt trapped, bound to them, like their suffering had somehow latched onto me, refusing to let go. As their voices grew louder, I could feel myself sinking, my will draining, as though their pain was becoming mine, dragging me down into the cold, dark water below. Somewhere, deep inside, a voice screamed at me to get away, to break free of the haunting grip of their gaze. With a surge of strength, I forced myself to snap out of the trance, to tear my eyes away from those desperate faces. Breath ragged, I gripped the oars, fighting the overwhelming urge to let go, to give in to the pull of the lights and sink into the depths alongside them. It took every ounce of willpower to turn away, to stop looking at those pleading faces, and row back to the darkness, back to the safety of the shore I could no longer see. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, hands trembling on the oars. My mind felt numb, as though I'd been plunged into the lake's icy depths myself. The whispers, the faces, they were everywhere, surrounding me in the mist. Every time I blinked, I saw that pleading look in their eyes, the desperate reach of their hands. My instincts screamed at me to row, to move, to do anything but sit there, but I couldn't look away. Then the light closest to me flickered, brightened, and I saw a figure step forward from the shadows, solidifying before my eyes. He was a young man, maybe in his 20s, with the pale, waxy skin of someone who'd spent too long underwater. His clothes hung from him like a second layer of skin, soaked and clinging, his hair dark and limp against his skull. But it was his face that stopped me cold, his expression hollow and sorrowful, a face twisted by endless grief. He opened his mouth and a strangled whisper escaped, barely more than a breath. "Please, don't leave." My mouth was dry. I wanted to respond, to say anything, but my throat felt like it was filled with sand. I watched, helpless, as the young man took a step closer, his face fixed on mine with a desperation I could feel down to my bones. Suddenly, more figures began to emerge from the fog, their faces pale, their eyes hollow and sunken. I recognized one of them, a man I'd known, a fisherman from town who'd gone missing years ago. The sight of him, standing there with that same haunted expression, made my stomach twist. He reached out a hand, and my eyes followed it, unable to look away as his fingers stretched toward me, shaking. "Help us," he whispered, his voice rasping like he'd been shouting for days. "Please, just help us." A wave of terror washed over me. I gripped the sides of the boat, the wood biting into my fingers, grounding me in reality. My mind struggled to make sense of it all. These were the souls of the lost, those who had drowned in the unforgiving waters of Lake Superior. And here they were, calling out to me, pleading for release. I felt a powerful urge to help them, to reach out and take their hands, to somehow lift them from the darkness that had claimed them. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice whispered a warning. These weren't living souls. They were trapped, caught between worlds, bound to the lake. If I reached out, if I touched them, I might be bound there too. The young man's face twisted in despair as he realized I wasn't moving toward him. The whispers turned louder, insistent, each voice a thin, desperate thread, winding its way around me, tugging at me. They moved closer, circling the boat, their faces blurring into one. Their eyes shone with an agony I couldn't bear to look at, a pain so deep it clawed at the edges of my mind. The lake began to churn, small waves lapping at the sides of the boat as if some invisible hand were shaking the water. I could feel a pressure beneath me, a pull from the depths, like the lake itself was trying to drag me under. I braced myself, trying to stay steady, but my heart hammered in my chest, the weight of their sorrow pressing down on me. One of the figures, the young man, reached out once more, his fingers brushing the edge of the boat. his gaze holding mine in a silent plea. "Please," he murmured, his voice breaking. "Don't leave us here." I swallowed, throat dry as sandpaper. I can't," I managed to choke out, barely recognizing my own voice. "I don't know how." The man's face fell, his hand slipping from the boat's edge. The others drifted closer, their mouths moving in silent pleas, their eyes filled with endless yearning. They were all around me now, so close I could feel the cold emanating from them, seeping into my skin, into my bones. It was as if they were trying to share their sorrow with me, trying to pass on the weight of their suffering. A voice in my mind screamed at me to leave, to break free, but I felt trapped, caught between their world and mine, unable to pull myself away. Their pain was suffocating, a dark tide rising inside me, threatening to drown me. And then, all at once, the young man's face twisted, his mouth opening in a scream. A soundless, silent scream that tore through the fog like a blade. His eyes widened, and his hand reached out one last time, the desperation on his face replaced with something far more chilling. An expression that said, "If you won't help us." My blood ran cold. I knew in that instant that they didn't just want my help, they wanted me. With a surge of terror, I snapped back to reality, the trance broken by a burst of pure, blinding panic. I gripped the oars, my body moving on instinct, and began to row, harder and faster than I'd ever rowed in my life. The whispers grew louder, an anguished chorus that followed me as I pushed through the water, the lights flickering like dying stars in the mist. As I rowed, I didn't dare look back. I couldn't bear to see their faces again, those eyes filled with despair, with longing, with something darker that I'd come too close to understanding. I focused only on the rhythm of the oars, pulling away from them, praying the shore was somewhere in the distance, waiting to take me back. The fog pressed in around me as I rowed, each pull of the oars a frantic push against the terror clawing at my mind. My arms ached, but the adrenaline numbed the pain, my only thought to get away, to escape the weight of their desperate eyes and hollow voices echoing in my ears. I couldn't tell if I was making progress or rowing in circles, but I knew one thing. I had to keep moving. Behind me, the whispers still drifted through the mist, faint but unmistakable. They weren't pleading anymore. Now they sounded angry, resentful, like a chorus of lost souls who had watched hope slip through their fingers, a flickering ember swallowed by the cold dark. I could feel them, hovering in the mist, watching as I pulled farther and farther away. The lake's surface began to ripple, gentle waves lapping at the boat as though the water itself was disturbed, stirring to life in response to my escape. A chill crawled up my spine, sharper than the autumn air. I didn't dare look over my shoulder, but I could feel their presence like shadows stretching from the depths. Every inch of me screamed to keep rowing, to put as much distance as possible between myself and those spirits trapped in the fog. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were reaching out, their hands stretching through the darkness, clawing for any piece of me they could hold on to. My breath came in short gasps as I rowed harder, the fog swirling thick and dense around me. I couldn't see the shore. I couldn't see anything but gray, endless mist stretching in every direction. The boat creaked with each stroke, the wood straining under the pressure, and for a brief moment I thought I heard their voices rising, an agonized wail that seemed to come from all sides. The lake itself began to pull at the boat, subtle at first, a strange, unsteady rocking that grew more forceful with each passing second. It was like the water had become a living thing, reaching up to claim me, dragging me back to those haunting figures I was trying to leave behind. I glanced down and felt my heart seize. The water was churning below me, dark tendrils swirling in the depths, as though something far below was stirring, trying to rise to the surface. Panic surged through me. I fought against the lake's pull, the oars slicing through the water with frantic, uneven strokes. My arms burned, my body screaming in protest, but I couldn't stop. The only thought in my mind was to escape, to reach the safety of the shore, to put the lake and all its horrors behind me. But the whispers followed, louder and sharper, the words distorted, garbled, blending into a single anguished wail that seemed to claw its way into my skull. My vision blurred, my mind clouded by fear and exhaustion, until all I could see were their faces, the hollow eyes, the twisted expressions of sorrow and longing. I felt their presence pressing in, heavy and suffocating, the weight of their despair clinging to me like a shroud. Then, through the fog, I caught a glimpse, a break in the mist, the faintest hint of trees on the distant shore. Relief flooded through me, almost blinding in its intensity. I was close, closer than I'd realized. My arms felt numb, my body shaking with exhaustion, but the sight of the shore gave me the strength I needed to push forward. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I could feel the lake's grip loosening, the whispers fading as I moved closer to land. Just as I thought I'd escaped, a new sound cut through the mist. A low, mournful moan, rising from the depths of the lake, deep and resonant. It was different from the whispers, different from the voices of the trapped souls. This was the lake itself, a sound of anger and sorrow that seemed to vibrate through the water, through my bones, filling the air with an ancient, endless grief. I felt it pressing against me, heavy and cold, as though the lake itself were warning me, marking me as one of its own. I couldn't stop the shiver that ran through me. The voices were gone, but their absence felt even more chilling, like a predator watching in silence, waiting to strike. I forced myself to row faster, my arms like lead, each pull of the oars an agony. The shore grew closer, the trees slowly taking shape through the thinning mist, the promise of safety just within reach. With a final surge of effort, I broke through the last veil of fog and felt the boat scrape against the rocky shore. Relief crashed over me, and I scrambled out of the boat, my legs weak and unsteady as I staggered onto solid ground. I collapsed, my chest heaving, the cold, damp earth grounding me, reassuring me that I was safe, that I had escaped. But even as I lay there, breathless and shaking, I could feel the lake's gaze on my back, as though it hadn't quite released me. I stared out over the water, the fog slowly lifting, revealing the vast, silent stretch of lake that had almost claimed me. The lights were gone, the whispers silent, but their presence lingered, etched into my memory, impossible to forget. I knew, even then, that I would never truly escape. The lake had let me go, but it hadn't forgotten me. And somewhere, just beneath the surface, those lost souls still waited, their whispers fading but never silenced, forever calling out for someone to join them. It's been years since that night, but I still can't shake the feeling of cold that settled in my bones out there. I don't fish anymore, don't go near the lake at all. It's not just the sight of those faces or the sound of their voices echoing through the fog. It's the feeling that the lake isn't done with me yet, that it let me go that night, but only just barely. I still see them sometimes, mostly in my dreams, but sometimes in those quiet, sleepless hours when I'm alone. I'll be lying in bed, the house silent, the night pressing in on all sides, and I'll hear it. A faint whisper just outside my window carried on the night air. "Help us," they'll say, just as they did that night. The desperation is still there, laced with a sorrow so deep it makes my heart ache. I've come to recognize those voices, like old acquaintances who drift in and out of my life, uninvited but persistent. The worst part is that I don't know what they want. I told myself they were just lost souls, looking for someone to free them, but that feels too simple. It's as though they wanted more than freedom. They wanted someone to share in their sorrow, someone to carry the weight they've been bearing alone in the depths of Superior for who knows how many years. And maybe they wanted me to join them. People around here know about the lights on the water, but most think it's nothing more than a local legend, a story to tell around a fire on a dark night. I used to think that too. It's safer that way, easier to brush it off as a myth, something to scare newcomers. But after what I saw, what I experienced, I can't hear those stories without feeling a chill settle over me. I know they're more than just tales. I tried warning a few folks, but most didn't believe me, laughing it off or saying I'd had a bit too much to drink that night. The younger fishermen, the ones who've never known a loss out there, are especially quick to dismiss me. Just another ghost story, they say, shrugging it off. But I see the older folks, the ones who've been on the lake long enough to know its ways. They don't laugh. They don't question. They just listen, nodding with a kind of quiet understanding that tells me they've felt the lake's pull too. There was a time when I considered moving away, putting as much distance as I could between myself and Lake Superior. But I know it wouldn't make a difference. I can't leave this behind. The lake, those souls, they're a part of me now, woven into my bones. Every time I hear a story about another person lost out there, another boat that didn't make it back, I feel that familiar ache, that tug that never really left, and part of me wonders if one day I'll give in to it. On stormy nights when the lake is at its wildest, I find myself drawn back to the shore. I don't go out, not anymore, but I'll stand there, watching the waves crash against the rocks, the mist swirling above the water. Sometimes, if the night is dark enough and the wind just right, I'll see it. The faint glow of a light flickering far out on the lake, barely more than a spark in the darkness. And each time I see that light, I feel it calling to me, the same way it did that night. It's a whisper that slips through the cracks of my mind, a soft murmur that says, "Come back." The urge to go out there, to let the lake take me, is strong. Too strong sometimes. It's like a part of me is still with them, with those lost souls, and the lake is just waiting for the rest of me to join them. I tell myself it's just a trick of the light, a memory dredged up by the night. But deep down, I know it's more than that. It's a reminder that the lake hasn't forgotten me, that maybe, someday, it will claim what it left behind. So here I am, telling you this story, not because I expect you to believe me, but because I need you to know. If you ever find yourself out on Superior, especially at night, and you see a light in the distance, do yourself a favor, don't follow it. Turn back, get to shore, and don't look back. There are things in those waters that are best left alone, things that won't hesitate to drag you under if you give them the chance. And if you're ever near the lake, on a quiet night, and you hear a faint whisper calling to you, don't listen. No matter how desperate it sounds, no matter how familiar, turn away. It's easy to think the lake is nothing more than a body of water, but I'm telling you, there's more to it than that. Because when you've looked into the eyes of those who never left, when you've heard their voices calling out from the darkness, you understand. The lake never forgets. And someday it might come calling for you just as it did for me. The first time I heard it, I brushed it off. It was a faint sound, muffled, almost like the distant cry of a baby, but it came from the cellar, and I figured it was just the house settling. Old houses make strange noises, creaks and groans as if they have a life of their own. I had moved into this mansion a month ago, and though the place was beautiful, I hadn't fully adjusted to its character. I'm James Carrington, the owner of the place now, though I wasn't born into wealth. This mansion had fallen into my lap when I was looking for a new investment. The real estate listing called it a historic gem, and I couldn't resist. You don't get a chance to own something like this every day. Built just before the Civil War, this antebellum house had been sitting idle for years before I decided to turn it into a bed and breakfast. A business venture, sure, but I also thought it would be a good change of scenery. The first few days were busy, cleaning, preparing, getting everything in order. I barely had time to notice the strange creaks in the floorboards or the odd draft coming through the windows. But after a week, it became clear that the mansion wasn't as quiet as I'd hoped. One night, just as I was getting ready to lock up, I heard it again. Faint but persistent, as if someone were quietly crying from far below. I froze in place, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The basement. The sounds echoed from the dark depths of the cellar. I chalked it up to the pipes. Old plumbing has a way of making odd noises, and this house was no exception. The mansion had been built in 1852, and everything from the floorboards to the heating system was ancient. The basement, too, was a labyrinth of old storage rooms and cobwebbed corners. Nothing that would draw attention unless, of course, you were overly sensitive. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I stood at the top of the stairs leading down to the cellar, listening, but the sound had stopped. I sighed, dismissing it once more. It wasn't until the next morning that the whispers became more than a passing thought. I was just about to serve breakfast to my first few guests, a couple visiting from Charleston, when the wife mentioned it. "You wouldn't happen to know where that noise is coming from, would you?" she asked with a strained smile. It sounded like someone was crying, down in the basement maybe. I swallowed hard, my smile faltering for a second. "Crying?" I repeated, trying to keep my voice casual. "No, ma'am, I'm sure it's just the house's old pipes. It happens from time to time, just an old house, you know." She seemed unconvinced, but she nodded and went back to her coffee. I smiled again, but the unease lingered. I wondered if she'd heard it the same way I had, or if I was starting to imagine things. But then, a second guest, a man, a business traveler, brought it up as well. He mentioned the faint sobbing he'd heard from the basement while he was reading in his room. That was when I started to pay more attention. I'd heard of this place's reputation, of course. People said it was haunted, that the spirits of the past still roamed the halls. Some claimed that the house was cursed, tied to the tragic events of the Civil War, when it was used as a hospital and prison for Confederate soldiers. Some even swore they'd seen figures moving in the windows at night, shadows that didn't belong. But I never put stock in ghost stories. I had a business to run, and I wasn't about to let some old house's history get in the way of that. Still, there was something about the way the house settled at night, the way the air seemed heavier at certain times. When I went down to the basement that evening to check the pipes, the feeling was hard to ignore. There was an oppressive stillness that I couldn't shake. The crying hadn't returned, but the silence felt unnatural, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I'd always prided myself on being a practical man. This was just an old house with old plumbing. That was it, right? But as I turned to leave the basement and the door behind me creaked closed, I heard it again, a low, sorrowful cry. It was unmistakable this time, a voice that was unmistakably human. I stood still, heart racing. The cry sounded so desperate. There was something about it that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The basement was cold, colder than it had been moments before. "Just the house," I muttered to myself, but my voice didn't sound convincing. I didn't turn around to go back down, though, not yet. Something told me I wasn't going to find a simple explanation, not in this house. The following day, I tried to ignore the feeling that had settled in my chest. I had a business to run, and I couldn't afford to let my mind wander too far down the path of superstition. I spent most of the morning fixing a leaky faucet in the kitchen and adjusting the air conditioning in the guest rooms. Normal tasks, practical tasks, things that kept me grounded. But as the sun set and the guests gathered in the dining room, the memory of that cry lingered. I kept hearing it in my head, a faint, sorrowful sound that seemed to echo through the walls. I couldn't quite place it, but every time I thought about the basement, the sound grew clearer in my mind. I was just about to serve dinner when the elderly woman who had mentioned the crying earlier approached me again, looking even more uneasy than before. "Mr. Carrington," she said, her voice quiet, as though she didn't want to draw attention. "I don't mean to be a bother, but I'm hearing it again, the crying, down in the basement." I nodded, forcing a reassuring smile. "Like I said, ma'am, it's just the pipes. Old plumbing can be temperamental." I couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt as the words left my mouth. I was starting to sound like a broken record. She didn't seem convinced, but she nodded and returned to her seat. I, on the other hand, couldn't shake the dread gnawing at my stomach. I'd tried to ignore it for days, but the incidents were stacking up. And now, more than one guest had heard it. I decided to check the basement again that evening. I told myself it was just for peace of mind, that I needed to rule out any mechanical issues before my guests got any more unsettled. As the evening wore on, I couldn't focus on anything other than that noise. I didn't want to appear paranoid, but something told me I had to go down there to see for myself. As I descended into the basement, the air felt heavier, the silence more suffocating. The dim light from the overhead bulb did little to cut through the shadows that seemed to stretch across the stone walls. The cold draft swept through the space, and I tightened my jacket around my shoulders. I scanned the room, noting the dust-covered shelves and the cobwebs hanging from the rafters. The basement looked just as I remembered it, unused and untouched, except for the old boxes and crates. No sign of pipes leaking, no strange source of the sound. But then I heard it, that cry. Louder this time, clearer. It wasn't just the faint, distant sound I'd dismissed before. It was unmistakable, a wail, full of despair. The noise echoed through the room, seeming to come from all directions. It filled the space, thick and oppressive. It was like someone was standing right next to me, crying out for help. I froze. I told myself it was just the pipes, just an old building settling. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized I couldn't ignore it anymore. The sound was too human, too real. And then I heard something else. Whispers. Soft, unintelligible words that fluttered in and out, as if they were being spoken just out of earshot. I moved toward the source, my heart pounding. I hadn't been down here long, but already the air felt colder than the rest of the house. I could see my breath misting in front of me, a sure sign that something wasn't right. I reached for the light switch. It flickered and hummed before coming to life, casting a dim glow across the room. The walls seemed to close in on me. And then, as my eyes wandered to the far corner of the basement, something caught my attention. A crack in the wall. I had been in this basement a dozen times and never noticed it before. A small, almost imperceptible seam running down one of the stone walls. Curiosity got the best of me. I approached it, my hand hovering near the crack, not sure what I was expecting. Maybe it was just a natural flaw in the stone, but something about it didn't sit right. I ran my fingers over the crack, pushing gently against the wall. The stone was cold, rough to the touch, but as I applied pressure, the wall shifted ever so slightly. A hidden door. I wasn't sure how I hadn't noticed it before. The seam was barely visible, as though it had been intentionally obscured, or perhaps just forgotten over time. I pushed harder. The door creaked open, the sound sharp in the quiet room, revealing a small, narrow space behind it. My pulse quickened, and I stepped inside, the whispers growing louder with each step. The cellar felt like it was holding its breath, the air thick with something I couldn't quite name. The hidden room was cramped and cold, barely large enough to fit a man standing upright. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed the remnants of chains, old iron shackles, rusted and forgotten, dangling from the walls. A chill ran through me. This wasn't just some storage room. The atmosphere was wrong. The air was thick with the weight of something that had been buried long ago. I stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest. On the far wall, there were deep claw marks, scratches, scrapes, the unmistakable signs of a desperate struggle. I felt the temperature drop further, my breath visible in the air. My skin prickled with the sense that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me, waiting. And then, just as I was about to step back, I heard it again, the crying. But this time, it wasn't coming from the other side of the room. It was right next to me. "Don't leave me," a voice whispered so close it sent a tremor through my bones. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was paralyzed, standing in the dark, my heart racing in my chest. The voice was faint, barely a breath, but it was unmistakable. I wasn't alone. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. My breath shallow, frozen in place, as the whisper echoed through the small, dark room. "Don't leave me." The words weren't loud, but they were unmistakable, the voice raw with desperation. My heart was pounding so loudly that I thought it might drown out the voice, but instead, everything seemed to grow quieter. The cellar, the distant hum of the house, it all fell away. It was just me and the voice now, hanging in the still air. I snapped out of my trance and bolted from the room, my feet stumbling over the uneven floor as I scrambled back through the hidden door, slamming it shut behind me. I stood there for a moment, my hand on the stone wall, trying to collect myself. My breath was ragged, the weight of the cellar pressing in on me, thick and suffocating. I could still hear the faintest echo of the crying, muffled by the stone, but somehow closer now. I didn't want to go back down there. I didn't want to face whatever that was, but I knew I couldn't just ignore it. The house was old, yes, but there was something else here. Something that had been hidden for far too long. I needed answers. The next morning, after I'd gotten some sleep, or tried to at least, I began to research the house's history. There were a few local archives, dusty old records, and a couple of old-timers who'd lived in Savannah their whole lives. I'd heard rumors of the house's past, of course. Everyone in the area had. They spoke of its grandeur, its fame, but mostly they spoke of its dark history. It wasn't just an antebellum mansion. The house had been used as a hospital during the Civil War, and later it became a prison for captured soldiers and enslaved people. They said it had been a place of suffering, a place where people had died, some in agony, others in silence, buried in the basement, their spirits left to haunt the halls. As I pieced together the information, I couldn't help but shiver. The hidden room, the shackles, the claw marks on the walls, it all made sense now. It wasn't just a storage space. It had been a prison, a place where people had been kept in the most horrific of conditions. I went through the old records, reading about the people who had been imprisoned here, their lives cut short by violence and cruelty. Some of them had never been identified, their names lost to time, but there were a few that stood out. People who had died in that very basement, their spirits likely bound to the house for all eternity. But none of this explained the voices. I spent the rest of the day combing through more records, tracing the stories of the enslaved people who had been kept here, reading about the Confederate soldiers who had been tortured. One name kept popping up: Elias King, a young soldier captured during a skirmish, a man who had been kept in the basement for days before he died, alone and in agony. There was no record of his body ever being recovered. It felt like a sign, but I wasn't sure what to make of it. Could Elias King's spirit still be trapped in the house? Was he the one who had whispered to me? That night, I went back down to the basement, armed with the new knowledge I had uncovered. The house felt different, colder, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for me to return. The air was thick with tension, and as I descended the stairs once more, I could almost feel the weight of the past pressing down on me. I walked to the hidden door again, my fingers brushing against the crack in the stone. My heart raced, but I forced myself to push through the fear. The door creaked open, and the darkness swallowed me whole. The room was just as I remembered: small, confined, with the remnants of chains and rusted iron. The air felt heavy, like the walls themselves were closing in. I felt a coldness that sank deep into my bones, and for a moment I thought I might turn and leave, but I couldn't. Not now. I took a deep breath and stepped further into the room, my eyes scanning the walls, searching for anything that might give me more answers. That was when I noticed something I hadn't seen before: a faded, yellowed piece of paper, half hidden beneath a pile of rotting cloth. I crouched down and gently pulled it free. It was a letter, old and brittle, the ink smeared in places, but still legible. The letter was from Elias King. It was brief, just a few lines. To whoever finds this, know that I died here, alone, without mercy. I was left to rot in this place, forgotten by all. Do not leave me here. Help me find peace. The words hit me like a physical blow. The voice, the crying, the whispers, they were his. Elias King's spirit was still here, trapped in the basement, still begging for someone to hear his story. I swallowed hard, my throat tight with emotion. I couldn't leave him here, not like this. But I didn't know what to do next. How could I help a spirit find peace when I didn't even know where to begin? I stood there in the dark, holding the letter, listening to the faint sounds of crying that seemed to come from everywhere. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Don't leave me," they pleaded. And I knew that leaving the house, leaving this behind, wasn't an option anymore. Whatever had happened here, whatever had been buried beneath the weight of history, it wasn't done with me yet. I didn't sleep much that night. I couldn't, not after what I'd found in that hidden room. The letter from Elias King weighed heavily on my mind, and the sound of his voice, his desperate plea, echoed through my thoughts like a relentless drumbeat. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just ignore the past any longer. I had to find out what happened to him, to the others who had suffered in that basement. There was a lingering question that gnawed at me. Why had this place been built as it was? Why was it used for such cruelty? And why had the spirits remained trapped in its walls for so long? The next morning, I went straight to the local archives. I'd spent a good portion of the previous day going through records, but I wasn't about to stop now. I needed to know more. I needed answers. The archive building was a squat brick structure, the kind that had been around for a century, but had seen little modernization. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old paper. There was a musty, oppressive feel to the place, but it was where the history of Savannah had been preserved for decades, and that was where I needed to be. The archivist, a middle-aged woman with glasses perched on the edge of her nose, gave me a disinterested glance as I walked in. She didn't seem to expect much from me. Just another curious soul looking into some old house's folklore, I assumed. "What can I help you with?" she asked, her voice dry. "I'm looking into the history of the old Carrington house," I said, trying to sound casual. "Specifically, the use of the basement during the Civil War." Her eyebrows raised. "That's quite a specific request. Not many are interested in the history of the house itself, especially not in that way." "I've heard some unsettling things," I said, feeling the truth of it all settle deeper in my chest. "I think there's more to the story than what's been told." The archivist looked at me with a measuring gaze, and then, with a resigned sigh, she motioned for me to follow her. "You're not the first to ask about it," she muttered, walking to a back room filled with rows of filing cabinets and stacks of old documents. "Some things are better left alone, you know." But she didn't stop. She pulled open one of the cabinets and began pulling out file after file, old newspapers, journals, and what looked like military records. "I'll warn you now," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The truth behind that house isn't something people want to know." I didn't have time to be cautious. I needed to know. The first file she handed me was filled with official military documents, reports from soldiers stationed in Savannah during the Civil War. The more I read, the more horrified I became. The basement had been used not just as a prison, but as a makeshift hospital for the Confederate Army. Soldiers, both prisoners and those wounded in battle, had been subjected to brutal treatments, and many had died of infections or malnutrition. But that wasn't the worst of it. The second file held even darker secrets. It was a journal, written by a man named Colonel Samuel Davenport, the head of the prison that had been set up in the mansion. The journal described in chilling detail the conditions of the prisoners, their treatment, and the horrors that took place within those very walls. In one entry, Davenport wrote, "The men grow weaker by the day. I've had to resort to measures I would never have thought possible, separating the strongest from the weakest, using them as examples to keep the others in line. There have been rumors of escape attempts, of prisoners trying to rebel. We have had to make an example of them. I won't tolerate disobedience in my house." The more I read, the more my stomach twisted. This wasn't just a place of suffering. It was a place of terror, of cruelty, where lives had been stripped of their dignity, where the cries of the innocent had been ignored, just as they were now. But the journal's last entry made my blood run cold. It detailed a final, terrible night. One of the prisoners, Elias King, has become a problem. His protests, his defiance have made him a symbol of unrest among the others. I will not have it. He's been placed in the underground room, a punishment for his behavior. No one will see him again, and if they do, it will be only as a lesson to them all. The entry ended abruptly. There was no mention of what had happened to Elias King after that night. I slammed the journal down onto the table, my hands shaking. This was it. Elias had been locked in that very room, left to die alone and forgotten. He had been abandoned, his spirit trapped in that place by the cruelty of men who had long since passed. I had been right all along. The house was cursed, not by some supernatural force, but by the bloodshed and cruelty that had stained its walls. And now Elias was calling out for help, not only for himself, but for all those who had been forgotten. I felt the weight of the history press down on me, but I also knew one thing. I couldn't leave. Not now. Not with everything I had uncovered. I had to set things right. I had to find a way to release the spirits that still haunted the house, including Elias. But how? How could I free them after so long? What was the answer? I didn't have the answers yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't do it alone. I couldn't keep going in circles. I had the history, I had the information, but I still didn't have the answers. The more I thought about Elias King's desperate plea, the more certain I became that I was the one who had to finish what had been started all those years ago. But I wasn't sure how to set things right. How does one free a spirit trapped in agony for over a century? I spent hours staring at the files the archivist had given me, trying to make sense of everything. The basement, the shackles, the claw marks on the walls. They were all part of a story much darker than I could have imagined. The deaths, the suffering. They were all tangled in that house, and I wasn't sure how I was supposed to carry the weight of it. It was well past midnight when I finally decided I needed help. I couldn't do this alone. Whatever curse or spirit had been lingering here, it wasn't just some ghost story. It was real, and I needed someone with the experience and knowledge to deal with it. I had heard whispers from the locals about a woman named Annabelle Harris, a medium who had a reputation for dealing with spirits who refused to rest. Her name had come up more than once in conversations with other innkeepers in the area. They said she was someone who could communicate with the dead, someone who could guide lost souls to the peace they had been denied. I wasn't sure what I believed in terms of the supernatural, but I knew this. I was out of my depth. I needed answers, and Annabelle Harris seemed to be the only person who might be able to provide them. I found her contact information in the local phone book. It felt strange, even old-fashioned, to search through a dusty, yellowed list of names. But I dialed the number, the ring of the phone echoing in the silence of my office. After a few rings, a voice answered on the other end. "Hello?" Her voice was soft, but there was a sense of calm certainty in it, something that immediately put me at ease. "Miss Harris?" I asked, my voice tight with uncertainty. "My name is Thomas Carrington. I own the old Carrington house here in Savannah. I've encountered something in the house, something I can't explain. I've heard rumors that you help people with, well, situations like mine." There was a pause on the other end, and then she spoke again, her tone measured but understanding. "I know the house you're talking about, the one on Madison Square. I've heard the stories, Thomas. And yes, I can help. But you have to understand something. The house is a living thing. It's haunted by a history much darker than you realize. You can't just push the spirits away, they'll fight back." My pulse quickened. "You think it's dangerous?" "I know it is," she replied, her voice unwavering. "But I can help. I can reach out to the spirits trapped there, bring them the peace they've been denied. But it's going to take more than just words. It's going to take understanding, and it's going to take the willingness to face the truth." I swallowed hard. This wasn't going to be easy, but I knew I had no choice. "I'm ready," I said, trying to make my voice sound confident, even though I wasn't sure what I was getting myself into. "What do I need to do?" She gave me directions to her home, a small, unassuming cottage on the edge of town. It was late by the time I arrived, and the whole place looked almost like a shadow in the dark. The front door was open, and the light inside flickered warmly, casting long shadows across the yard. I hesitated before knocking, but the moment my knuckles rapped against the door, I felt it. The weight of something old and watchful, as if the house itself was aware of my presence. The door creaked open, and there she stood, Annabelle Harris. She was in her mid-40s with long dark hair that cascaded in waves down her back. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and when she looked at me, I felt like she could see straight through me. "Come in, Thomas," she said softly, stepping aside to allow me in. "We don't have much time." I followed her inside, and immediately the air felt different, thick, like it was holding its breath. The cottage was small but cozy, filled with bookshelves and strange artifacts, crystals, candles, and small statues of gods and goddesses. The scent of incense lingered in the air, mixing with the faint smell of something burning in the fireplace. Annabelle motioned for me to sit, and I did, my eyes scanning the room, unable to shake the feeling that everything around me was watching. "I've felt the energy from your house ever since you called me," she said, sitting down opposite me. "The spirits are restless. They've been calling out for help, and now you've answered. But it's not going to be easy, Thomas. You're dealing with something much older and more dangerous than you realize." "I don't care how difficult it is," I said, my voice firmer now, driven by a sense of responsibility. "I have to help them. I have to help Elias." Annabelle's eyes softened at the mention of Elias King. "You know his name, then," she said quietly. "He's one of the many souls trapped there, but there are others, souls that were forgotten, left behind by history. They won't be at peace until they are acknowledged, until someone remembers." I nodded, my mind swirling with everything I'd learned. "How do we do it? How do we release them?" Annabelle took a deep breath, her expression serious. "We'll begin by communicating with them, opening the doorway between the living and the dead. But first, you need to face the truth of what happened in that house. You need to acknowledge the history, not just of Elias, but of all the others. Only then can we help them move on." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I didn't hesitate. "I'm ready." "Good," she said. "Tomorrow night we'll begin." The day stretched on, each hour heavier than the last. By the time evening rolled around, I was on edge, the anticipation gnawing at me. The idea of confronting the spirits in the house, of facing the dark history that had festered there for so long, filled me with both dread and determination. Annabelle had arrived shortly before sunset, her presence almost soothing as she entered the Carrington house. She was quiet, observant, and immediately began setting up in the living room. Candles were lit, their soft flickers casting long shadows across the walls. A circle of stones, each one with strange markings, was arranged on the floor. In the center, she placed a bowl filled with water, the surface of which shimmered eerily under the candlelight. She motioned for me to sit across from her. "Tonight, we'll try to bridge the gap," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The spirits are restless, Thomas. But if we show them that we understand their pain, that we acknowledge their suffering, they will listen." I nodded, unsure of what to expect. I had read all the books on hauntings, curses, and the supernatural, but none of them had prepared me for the reality of what was about to unfold. Annabelle began chanting softly, her words unfamiliar but rhythmic, like an ancient language that reverberated in the air. The room felt heavy, as if something unseen was drawing closer. The candles flickered violently, and for a moment I swore I heard the faintest cry, a voice so distant it seemed to come from another time. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the shadows seemed to grow, stretching across the walls, their shapes twisting and writhing. It wasn't just the air that was colder. There was a presence here now, one that had been waiting, watching, a presence that I had felt every time I descended into that basement. "Elias," Annabelle whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing tension. "We know your pain. We know you've suffered, but you are not alone. We're here now. We're listening." The air thickened. It was no longer just a chill. It was a pressure, like being submerged in water, the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes pressing in from all sides. I closed my eyes and tried to focus, tried to push through the fear. And then, it happened. The room shifted. The air crackled with energy, the weight of it suffocating. I opened my eyes, and for the briefest moment I saw it, him, Elias King, standing just beyond the circle of light, his face a gaunt mask of pain. His eyes locked onto mine, pleading. His form was translucent, a mere wisp of a man, but his presence was undeniable. His soul was still trapped in the house, bound by the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. "Please." His voice was a whisper, soft and desperate, like a dying breath. "Don't leave me here." Annabelle's chant grew louder, more urgent, but her eyes were fixed on me, steady and calm. "Acknowledge his pain, Thomas," she urged. "He is not the only one. He speaks for all the souls here. You must acknowledge what happened." I swallowed, my throat tight. This wasn't just about Elias anymore. This was about every life lost in this place, every soul that had been left to rot in the shadows. It was a history that had been buried and forgotten, but it was time to bring it to light. "I see you," I said, my voice trembling. "I see you, Elias, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what was done to you." The words were barely out of my mouth before the temperature in the room plummeted even further. The shadows danced wildly, stretching and contorting like they were alive. The voices, the cries, the whispers, rose in volume, a cacophony of anguish that filled the room, drowning out everything else. "You have to say their names, Thomas," Annabelle urged. "Say the names of the others who suffered. Bring them into the light." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Names started to flood my mind. Soldiers, prisoners, and innocents, all forgotten by time. Names I had read in the old records, their lives marked by pain and death. I spoke them aloud, one by one, each name an offering, a recognition of the lives that had been lost. "Elias King," I said, my voice shaking. "Sarah Larkin, Joseph Finch, William Davis, so many more. I see you all. Your pain, your suffering, it has not been forgotten." As the names left my lips, the room seemed to vibrate with energy. The shadows swirled violently around us, but I held my ground, my heart racing. I could feel the presence of the spirits, their energy pulling at me, calling out for release. The temperature dropped further, frost forming on the edges of the water bowl in front of Annabelle. The room trembled. And then, in the blink of an eye, everything fell silent. The shadows receded, the temperature returned to normal, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the house lifted, just a little. Elias's form was still there, but now there was something different about him. His face had softened, the pain in his eyes replaced with something almost peaceful. His body seemed to flicker, as if the very air around him was unraveling. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Thank you for remembering." And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. The silence that followed was profound. It wasn't just the house that was quiet. It felt as though time itself had paused, holding its breath. Annabelle exhaled softly, her eyes closed in concentration. When she opened them again, she smiled. But it wasn't a smile of triumph, it was something gentler, filled with understanding. "It's done," she said quietly. "They are free now. All of them." I sat there, my heart still pounding in my chest, trying to process everything that had just happened. The room felt lighter, the air clearer. The house no longer seemed like a place of suffering. It was still old, still full of memories, but now, those memories felt at peace. I stood up, feeling like I had just woken from a dream that had been rooted in history and pain. "Thank you, Annabelle," I said, my voice rough with emotion. I didn't know what to do." "You did it, Thomas," she said gently. "You acknowledged the past, and that's what they needed. They didn't need to be forgotten anymore." As I stood in the quiet, empty house, I realized that the change wasn't just in the spirits. It was in me too. I had faced something I didn't believe in, something I had been running from my entire life. And now it was over. The house wasn't haunted anymore. At least, not by the things I had feared.